Um, okay, so a short idea. So starting this week, what is the main theme of the saga that continues from now, basically until the end of Breshit? Yes, Mechirat Yosef and the fallout of Mechirat Yosef, the tshuva of Mechirat Yosef, the reconciliation of Mechirat Yosef. It is by far the longest narrative arc in the entire Torah. And this, to make sure we get at least one Hanukkah thing in, these parashiyot always appear around Hanukkah, which now what I'm saying might be a vort. I think both parts are true. Whether the connection is true, I don't know, right? But the pairing of these is suggestive, because in the end of the day, as guys remember when we learned Maccabees last year, Hanukkah is also a story of a civil war amongst brothers. So again, whether this is intentional or not, thematically the pairing does seem suggestive. However, I think that in truth, the pairing, if anything, points out the contrast more than the similarity. And this is, I was reading a fascinating article by Professor Gerald Blidstein, who passed away, I think, last year maybe. He was a Talmud of the Rav. From various accounts I've heard, either the or one of the smartest Talmidim that ever passed through the Rav Shir. He was a professor of philosophy, of Jewish intellectual history at Ben Gurion, I believe. He won the Israel Prize. So he has an article in Tradition about the Chazal and Hanukkah, the missing players. And he said it's interesting, right? If you ask anybody what is Hanukkah about, what's the story that Hanukkah is about, if they know anything about Maccabees, what do they say it's about? About Hanukkah. If they know anything about Book of Maccabees, whether or not they've read it, they say that it was a culture war, right? And a big part of that culture war was Jew against Jew, was Jew against Hellenizer. However, if you didn't know anything about the Book of Maccabees, then A, you've never learned with me, but that's a different story. But if you've never read the Book of Maccabees and all you knew was Chazal, then you have two sources of information about this story. One is the Gemara in Shabbos, and the other is Al Hanisim. From the Gemara in Shabbos, you know that there was some sort of conflict with the Greeks, and you know about the miracle with the oil. And if you read Al Hanisim, so you only know about the war, you know nothing about the oil, which is a story for another time. You would not know about it, but again, you would know about the war against the Jews, between the Jews and the Greeks. But you would not know from any account in Chazal, neither Talmudic or liturgical, that this was in any way a war, Jew versus Jew. So the question is why, right? If it's true historically, which we have no reason to believe it's not, I mean, all the other accounts that we have, Maccabees or otherwise, right? I think Josephus has it as well, mention that part of the war is against Hellenizers, and not just against the Greeks, right? In Maccabees, it's that dramatic, Mattatyahu killing the Hellenizer, and he's willing to bring the pig as a korban. So Blidstein suggests 3 answers to this issue. One, he suggests, is that Chazal didn't want to acknowledge the draw of Hellenistic culture on Jews, right, and open it up as a possibility. That's one possibility. But his other possibilities, right, are that, look, maybe it was Jew versus Hellenizer as well, but Chazal could not imagine that that would be a reason to celebrate. Right? Chazal, even if it's true that it was necessary for the Jews to fight each other in addition to the Greeks, they could not imagine that we would make a holiday because we successfully beat other Jews. So, one second. Right? And another answer that he suggests is maybe it's not just that we couldn't celebrate, I'm doing it out of order, is he thinks that the Hellenizer versus Jew thing makes it too black and white. Because it's very odd to say, oh yeah, there were Jews and there were Hellenizers and the Jews were all good and Hellenizers were all bad. If you know anything about the history of sectarian groups in Bayit Sheni, for example, you'll know that the line between traditional Jew and not traditional Jew was not at all clear. Give me a good piece of evidence for that. Right, Chazal v'ay v'lam malshinim, right, v'laminim. That they said if someone gets up as Chazan and stutters on any bracha, so no problem, right? Everything was by heart. Sometimes you'll forget. But if he got up and he stuttered on the bracha of minim, you kick him out of shul because he's probably a heretic. But what does that tell you? That the minim were in shul, right? That these sectarians were almost indistinguishable from the rest of the Jewish community. So Blitzstein's suggestion is that it may be that there was a battle between Jews and Jews, but to make it as if it was clear who was a Jew and who was a Hellenizer, rather than maybe a Jew who appreciated Greek culture and was still part of the Jewish community, right? That line is very difficult to draw. So I think that the latter two answers of Blitzstein suggest that, accidental or not, it provides an interesting contrast to Vayeshev and on, to the story of Mechirat Yosef, where even if they're both, in the end of the day, stories that come down in many ways to a internal Jewish fight, the fact that Chazal don't mention this part of Hanukkah tells you, A, even if necessary, that's never something to celebrate, right? It's always something to be avoided. And the second is that these things are never black and white, right? If nothing else is clear in the Yosef story, is that Yosef is to blame partially, the brothers are to blame partially. It's very easy to make one to be the villain and the other to be the hero, but in the end of the day, that's not the case, right? They clearly were more, right? The brothers were clearly more wrong than Yosef, but. And we've talked about this in past years, maybe we'll talk about it again, the Torah seems to go out of its way to make it clear that it's still not all bad versus all good, right? And highlight the problems in Yosef's behavior as well. So Blitzstein's suggestion that Chazal don't highlight this as a war between Jews and Hellenized Jews, A, because we don't want to pretend that things are easily black and white. We recognize that even when there are fights, things are gray. And therefore, it's very hard to set up this nice fictional story of heroes and villains. And two, that even if it is legitimate to fight, it's never something to celebrate, really puts Hanukkah, as Chazal understand it, in contrast with or not as Chazal understand it, the way Chazal present it, right, provide insight into the Mechirat Yosef stories, where if it happens, it's not something that, right, we celebrate, and therefore Chazal go out of their way to tell the story in the way that does not present internal Jewish fighting as an ideal, and rather hide that and make it, if there has to be an enemy, it's the enemy, it's the outside enemy, but among ourselves, we really try to minimize that brotherly fight. Okay, so that's a Parsha and Chanukah Vort.